One of the greatest macroeconomic trends across the last 1,000 years of Chinese history has been a gradual shift of gravity southward. This shift does not stop at the Great Yangtze River that we looked at last time, but has continued with momentum towards the far southern regions of China, and has been trickling down for a few hundred years also towards the far southwest. The general reasons for this shift would be worth a book on their own. But we can generally say that the growth of regional and global trade, combined with the more common invasions and warfare in northern China, are major economic reasons, and the necessity for the state to better integrate and hold on to the far southern and southwestern frontier regions are major political regions. The first macro-region we need to analyze is the Upper Yangtze. The Upper Yangtze macro-region coincided essentially with the massive province of Sichuan, surrounded by mountains that separate the Yangtze basin from Tibet and Yunnan province. No part of China witnessed a faster population growth than the southwest as a whole. During the time when millions of Europeans were emigrating to America, millions of Chinese from all over the country came to Yunnan and Sichuan in pursuit of a better life. The economically important core coincided even more closely than in other regions with the navigable stretches of the river system. The region's main economic centers have always been two, the cities of Chengdu and Chongqing, which means that Sichuan province effectively has two centers of gravity. Before the late 19th century, Chengdu was central and Chongqing secondary, while later on the opposite is true. In the 18th century, Sichuan was booming and attracted merchants from afar, providing jobs for landless peasants along with land, and produced a high agricultural output. Local government had been extremely lax on land reclamation and land registration, which served the purpose of attracting settlers and indirectly supporting poor immigrants. These low tax rates and exemptions helped to keep food prices lower than in the neighboring provinces, and a second economic policy measure helped to revive the salt business. The salt industry was in fact massive in Sichuan. Salt production and merchandise were in private hands. New wells were bored with a tax exemption of several years. The salt industry was centered around Sichuan's third largest city, Cegong, because of the abundance of deposits and the available supply of fuel for salt works. Various types were used in the production process, including firewood, rushes, straw, coal, but also natural gases, which fostered ancillary industries along with the salt mining. Sichuan also has been a strategic possession for the Chinese Empire since the Han Dynasty. But by the Qing, the province as a whole was only starting its growth in importance, which would catapult the province into the political spotlight for almost the entire Republican period. Yunnan and Guizhou are China's wild and diverse southwestern provinces. Like Sichuan, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, these provinces were in the process of being more firmly integrated within the greater Chinese Empire. In the course of this fundamental transformation, many regions formerly only loosely tied to the empire and ruled by native chieftains known as Tu Si were merged into the state administration, a policy which was called Gai Tu Gui Liu. In the 18th century, the population of Yunnan dramatically increased thanks to incoming Han Chinese migration, from 4 to 5 million in 1700 to 11 million in 1775. In the multi-million-strong migratory movement to Yunnan from the 1750s to 1850s, the Han Chinese for the first time became the majority of the population, reaching around 60% of the total, a proportion which has stayed roughly the same ever since. The rest belonged to a myriad of different ethnic groups scattered across the rough mountains and valleys of this remote corner of Asia. The closer integration of Yunnan and its population into the Chinese Empire began under the Mongol Yuan, who helped to foster the spread of the Islamic creed by bringing migrants from Central Asia. Yunnanese Muslims, despite their low numbers, came to play quite a significant role in both political and economic spheres, and many of them rose to prominence, such as the famous navigator and diplomat of the early Ming, Zheng He. They dominated the caravan trade to Southeast Asia. Other important ethnic groups were the Bai, or white people, who lived in borderlands with Burma, and the more troublesome Yi, or Lullus, and Miao, also known as Hmong, who were engaged with constant feuding with the Chinese immigrants and authorities, and often were involved in bloody rebellions. Nevertheless, despite conflict and exploitation, the frontier region became a sort of middle ground where newcomers and natives could adopt to one another. Of enormous importance to the Chinese economy were both the copper mined in Yunnan as well as the zinc from Guizhou province, of which the vast majority of China's coins were cast from. China's broader currency system was based on a silver standard, but the majority of commonly used coins were cast from copper, so supply of copper and silver became fundamental to the stability of the currency. Yunnan boasted the richest and most extensive copper deposits of China, the most important of which were the mines of Dongchuan, Yimen, and Yongsheng. In 1705, old mines which had been abandoned in the chaos of the Ming collapse and the feudatory rebellions were reopened. A ban on private mining was lifted, and private entrepreneurs were invited to operate new mines, stimulating migration and investment. Yunnan also set forward trade routes with Southeast Asia by caravan, but the borderlands' treacherous terrain, the region's chronic ethnic unrest, and the shaky relationship with the neighboring Burmese kingdom, which we shall see soon turned bloody very often, meant that the trade possibilities of the region would only become fully apparent after the French colonization of Vietnam and the conquest of Burma by the British. The lower East Coast macro-region centered around Fujian province and incorporated parts of southern Zhejiang and eastern Guangdong. The coastal location gave this region's merchants a host of profitable trade contacts with Taiwan and Southeast Asia, which brought a certain cosmopolitanism and a highly developed system of credit and banking, particularly to the port of Amoy, known today as Xiamen. Further prosperity came from the rich tea farms of the region, the center to a trade that at the beginning of the 19th century would export more than 20 million pounds of leaves just to England alone. Fujian merchants long dominated interregional and export waterborne trade, with its natives comprising a large part of the communities of overseas Chinese that started to become ubiquitous by the 17th century. Fujian, in particular, was the key to vital silver imports from the Spanish New World, especially from Mexico, through Manila and Taiwan, a trade which was vital to stabilize the currency along with Yunnan copper, as we saw. Amoy was the arrival point of the traders from the region known to the Chinese as Nanyang, Southern Ocean, basically the analogous to the English terms South China Sea and Southeast Asia. The Chinese traders had taken advantage of shifting political and economic situation caused by the arrival of the Europeans in the region to gain substantial influence in these markets, a process which we shall explore in the future. A trickle of Western traders seeking to avoid the regulations of the port of Guangzhou, known to the Westerners as Canton, also appeared, until in 1757 Emperor Qianlong would formally restrict all of their trade to the southernmost port, where the Westerners would be confined until the British would start testing this enforcement in the coming century. For a mixture of historical and geographical regions, unlike the cosmopolitan and developed coast, this region's interior was driven by fierce localisms. Powerful lineages controlled whole villages, and feuds between them were deadly and frequent. Many richer homes were heavily fortified. Tenancy rates, that is, the amount of peasants forced to pay rent for the land that they worked, were high, and there were violent tensions involving recent immigrants and the poor inland farmers on their terraced mountainsides. Strong local accents and dialects made contact with outsiders difficult, and the region's elite were sliding in the scale of national prestige, producing fewer and fewer holders of the highest examination degree, the Jinshi. The Qing government thus identified this region as a potential trouble spot and kept it heavily garrisoned. Liangguang, or the Two Expanses, was the southernmost region of the core Chinese realm, and one that would have a pivotal role in the Middle Kingdom's harsh climb to modernity. The two provinces of Guangxi, the western expanse, and Guangdong, the eastern expanse, were quite different from each other in geography and ethnic composition, but were bound together by the river system, and thus formed a collective economic unit, known as Liangguang or Lingnan, partially separated from the rest of China by mountain ranges. Guangxi was in many ways similar to fellow southern provinces Guizhou and Yunnan on the surface. a mountainous lush borderlands province populated by a patchwork of entrenched aboriginal ethnic groups clashing with the advance of the Han Chinese settlers, both Hakka and Cantonese. It was one of China's poorest provinces, and it had experienced a staggering 218 rebellions during the Ming's 276 years of rule. Guangdong, on the other hand, was projected towards the sea. At every turn of political turmoil in the north, the province's access to the wider Nanyang trading network became more important, and the Manchu conquest was no different, as it intensified the movement of people, goods, and capital southward. This did not mean that the province didn't know ethnic strife. Like the other southern provinces, there were pockets of aboriginal groups in the hinterlands, along with a relatively recent wave of settlers from central China who were referred by the Cantonese term for guest family, Hakka. Relations between the Hakka and the native Cantonese, known as the Punti, were tense as they struggled for land. Additional land pressure would help build up tension, which fostered ethnic solidarity and discipline within the Hakka, who would later play an outsized role in the Taiping Rebellion and the Chinese National Revolution. Guangxi's economy was oriented towards the export of rice towards Guangdong because of this connection provided by the West River, while Guangdong imported various Chinese products, such as silk, exporting them to Southeast Asia, also tea, while an internal grain market flourished, which allowed the farmers in the Pearl River Delta to allocate land to cash crops. The province, just like neighboring Fujian, had to recover from a severe crisis during the struggle between the Qing and Ming loyalist regime of Zheng Chenggong on Taiwan, which severely had disrupted the trade and had also involved a massive program on the part of the Qing to resettle the population living on the coastland to deny Zheng's raiding forces supplies. It is estimated that across the Lingnan region, around 2 million people, around 15% of the population, had died during this crisis. But compared to the catastrophic loss of life of northern China, which was suffered during the Manchu conquest, this was nearly as crippling. Cultivated area in the province recovered right after the end of the crisis to the same levels as 1644 when the Ming dynasty fell, and trade was reopened. This trade allowed farmers to grow cash crops and import grain on the land that they were repopulating. It's important to note that while the trade we picture is Europeans coming into Canton, the European-Chinese trade did not become great in importance until the second half of the 18th century during Qianlong's reign. We will get to talk about the expansion of this European-Chinese trade and the so-called Canton system that emerged around it in the future. In 1757, Emperor Qianlong would formally restrict all foreign trade to the city of Guangzhou, known to the Westerners as Canton. While it would make sense that the restrictions of overseas trade to Canton would cause a regional economic slowdown affecting most of southern China, it was only Western merchants who were affected by the restriction, and Chinese trade wasn't just conducted with the West. The infamous Canton system served its purpose to prohibit the English from trading further up the coast at Nianbo, where they had found it possible to avoid some of the duties and bureaucracy levied at Canton. But it did not block the arrival of the Nanyang traders from the southern seas, so from Luzon, Sulu, Siam, and elsewhere, and it didn't affect the Zheng trade that was still fervent at Xiamen. The political situation of the 18th century was shifting in this region, as European powers were increasing their presence, which led to local regimes such as Siam and Sulu turning to Beijing, and a veritable trade war developing over Southeast Asian markets between Chinese and various groups of Western merchants. We don't have time to go more in depth into all of this right now. Since each of the macro regions had its own internal market and mostly self-sufficient economy, there was always the danger that in times of crisis they could provide a power base against central authority. If the centralizing state proved unable to mediate or control conflicts, the result might be either fragmentation or civil war. During the downfall of the Ming, between the 1630s and 1680s, peasant rebels, Ming loyalists, and free feudatories had each found temporary bases in different macro-regional cores. The task of the state, therefore, was to bond the regions together by ideological and administrative means, backed if necessary by military force. The Qing dynasty, as a result of the overwhelmingly agrarian nature of the economy and its imperial supremacist ideology, was not overly concerned with foreign trade and investment as functions important to the state. the regime was mainly concerned with preserving the agrarian social order, and foreign relations or trade were only marginal. Foreign relations were guided by the concentric hierarchy whereby order and civilization radiated outward from the emperor and China to various degrees of barbarian states, which were to be tributaries. Under the Ming, the Chinese emperors reserved themselves the right to confirm the succession of foreign rulers, conferring them titles, providing them with gifts and official seals, and entertaining correspondence with them in the Chinese language. It showed that China was the superior center, and its ruler had both duties and rights towards all other rulers, because they were his inferiors. The Qing re-established this regional order, which would continue to be viable and successful until the increased European presence shattered it. For now, the difficult unification of China's internal market, rowing against the tide of centuries of solidified local systems of ties and interests, was China's main challenge as a state. This did not prevent the Manchu rulers from looking outward, to expand their influence towards the lands always coveted by strong Chinese dynasties, Central Asia and Southeast Asia. It is precisely the long march towards Central Asia and the restoration of the Chinese world order that will be the subject of the next episodes of this series.